Roosevelt, great magician of the anti-union drive. And who orchestrated this grand charade? None other than President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, the head man who enabled this anti-union drive. J. Edgar Hoover was the architect of this campaign. FDR was the master magician who made it all seem perfectly reasonable. Hoover was the architect of the FBI's specific policies. FDR was the ultimate authority. He understood the essential truth of American politics. You can do anything to the people as long as you do it with a smile and a stirring speech about democracy. Don't be fooled by the fireside chats. Roosevelt was no starry-eyed friend of labor. He was a Machiavellian pragmatist playing both sides. The notion that the FBI operated in opposition to Roosevelt's political goals is a comely and comforting fiction. In truth, Roosevelt and Hoover worked in tandem. Roosevelt's brilliance was in his two-faced dance. His genius lay in his ability to appear pro-labor while systematically undermining labor's power. Though his legacy includes the pro-labor Wagner Act, his support for the working class was pragmatic and conditional. The Wagner Act with one hand and a green light to Hoover's witch hunts with the other, he kept his halo polished. He gave workers the Wagner Act with great fanfare, then quietly unleashed the FBI to ensure they couldn't use it effectively. It's like giving someone a beautiful watch, then breaking their wrist so they can't wear it. While Roosevelt's speeches crooned and praised the forgotten man, his administration's machinery was directed at crushing the very movements that might empower that man. He let Hoover's goons harass, surveil, and jail the very folks fighting for that man's rights. He gave Hoover free rein, knowing full well the FBI's sights were trained on labor's militant voices. Roosevelt was lauded as a friend of labor for his dangled carrots, like the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board and pro-union gestures during his first term. But by his second and third, the stick was out in force, allowing these more repressive tendencies to blossom. It's political theater at its most sublime, progressive in rhetoric, repressive in action, liberal in appearance, authoritarian in practice. In this anti-labor campaign, Roosevelt was not a passive observer. He was the head man who sanctioned the use of the iron fist within the velvet glove of the New Deal. Under FDR, the New Deal may have given workers minimum wage and Social Security, but it also ensured they remained under surveillance, vulnerable to prosecution, and dependent on a federal government that could turn on them at any moment. Roosevelt perfected a two-faced policy to ensure labor stayed leashed while Wall Street slept soundly. Roosevelt sought to manage and channel labor's power, not unleash it. The CIO, with its communist-leaning firebrands, was a particular thorn, threatening the campaign coffers of FDR's corporate pals. When labor militancy threatened to disrupt economic recovery or challenge his political authority, Roosevelt did not hesitate to authorize the use of state power against it. The antitrust prosecutions against unions, his Justice Department's doing. He turned the Justice Department into a union-busting operation. The expansion of the FBI's authority to investigate subversive activities, Dragnet, his presidential directive. His administration gave Hoover wide latitude, and Hoover repaid the favor by ensuring that labor unrest never threatened national industrial productivity or the campaign contributions of major donors. Roosevelt, the masterful politician, understood the need to maintain the support of the industrial, financial, and business elites who were terrified by the rise of organized labor. By letting Hoover run wild, FDR kept the industrialists placated and happy without ever breaking character as labor's pal, a friend of the working man. This assault on the working class, carefully planned and conducted in a most deliberate manner, became broader in scope, and the methods utilized became more brazen. The ultimate purpose of this elaborate charade wasn't just to suppress labor unrest. It was about preparing the nation for war. It was to modify the American workforce for the regimentation that would come with World War II. The government needed compliant workers, not militant ones, for the great industrial mobilization ahead. As World War II loomed, Roosevelt, acting as Wall Street's frontman, needed a docile workforce for the factories and a compliant populace for the draft. The FBI's campaign was a preemptive strike, systematically culling labor's militants to ensure minimal resistance when the war machine roared to life. The administration ensured that when the war came, workers would march to the factories as obediently as soldiers marched to the battlefield. Every raid, every prosecution, was a step toward regimenting the working class, terrorizing them into submission. The New Deal's gifts, minimum wage, Social Security, came with a leash. Step too far, and the state's iron fist would remind you who's boss. By these actions, they aimed to terrorize the workers, and especially their leaders, to ensure minimum resistance to the war plan. It was social engineering on a massive scale, disguised as law enforcement. Conclusion. The real joke is that this entire elaborate performance was sold to the American people as democracy in action. The New Deal wasn't just a series of programs, it was a magic trick, a sleight of hand that distracted the audience while the real work was being done behind the curtain. Roosevelt understood what every successful politician knows. The people will accept almost anything as long as you give them someone to blame and something to hope for. The early 20th century war on labor was not waged only in the factory or the courtroom, but in the minds of the American public, skillfully manipulated by federal agents and presidential power alike. FDR and Hoover, the smiling politician and the snarling law enforcer, played their parts to perfection. The Wagner Act gave workers a stage, but the FBI ensured the script stayed tame. While the administration enacted landmark legislation protecting the right to organize, one of its most powerful agencies was actively engaged in a campaign to undermine that very right. The history of the FBI during the Roosevelt administration reveals a stark contradiction at the heart of the New Deal. Though the New Deal is often remembered as a golden age of federal support for the working class, the reality is more complex and far less comforting. In the end, the New Deal was a promise of liberation that doubled as a shackle. The same government that birthed Social Security and the Works Progress Administration also birthed a surveillance state that dogged labor's every step, jailed their leaders, and sabotaged their right to organize. Understanding this dual legacy is essential not only for labor historians, but for anyone seeking to understand the tangled relationship between power, class, federal authority, and the deep state in America. The FBI's actions during the Roosevelt administration reveal a pattern of labor suppression cloaked in the language of law and order. Its role in suppressing labor during this era cannot be dismissed as bureaucratic overreach. It was a deliberate, organized, and deeply political effort to maintain the dominance of industrialists and keep the working class in check. Under the guise of protecting national security, the FBI, led by Hoover and with the consent of President Roosevelt, branded unionists as traitors, surveilled their every move, and twisted the law to crush their spirit. Under Hoover's leadership and with Roosevelt's blessing, the FBI transformed itself into the domestic intelligence arm of big business, branding dissent as subversion and trade unionism as treason. From inflated bail and inflammatory raids to bogus legal theories and ideological demonization, the Bureau functioned not as a neutral arbiter, but as an active agent of capital. J. Edgar Hoover's disdain for labor and Roosevelt's quiet acquiescence combined to make the 1930s and early 1940s one of the most perilous times for American labor organizers. The FBI and Roosevelt's administration employed a strategy of pervasive surveillance, legal harassment, through the misuse of laws like the Sherman Act, public vilification, and coordination with local police to break strikes and disrupt organizing drives. This concerted effort demonstrates that they acted as an instrument of deep state power to discipline the American working class, ensuring that its aspirations remained within the bounds deemed acceptable by the interests of capital and government. The Bureau's actions in the early 20th century cemented its role not as a neutral arbiter of the law, but as a partisan force working against the interests of organized labor. This, then, is the true legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal, a glittering myth of progress built on a foundation of repression. For every step forward, there was a shadow cast, a reminder that power, whether cloaked in liberal rhetoric or G-man bravado, always seeks to keep the worker in line. It's the eternal American con: promise the moon, deliver a muzzle. It's the dance of Maya, illusion and reality twirling together, leaving the working class to wonder which is which. In the end, the FBI under Roosevelt didn't just suppress labor, it helped create the modern American worker, grateful for small mercies, suspicious of collective action, and convinced that individual advancement is the only path to prosperity. It's social conditioning masquerading as law enforcement, and it worked beautifully. It's the perfect expression of the American paradox: a nation that proclaims liberty while practicing tyranny, that celebrates individual freedom while crushing collective action, that worships democracy while serving corporate power.